I'd like to welcome everyone to the MMA's Medical Marijuana Policy Forum. This is a forum that MMA is using to help determine what people's opinions are, to give knowledge from a panel of experts, and to give feedback back to the Board of Trustees as far as position statements that can be made regarding upcoming legislation. Not since the 1990s has the MMA visited position on medical marijuana. We looked at this in the late 90s, but have not had to re-look at it. With legislation being introduced this year, we decided that we needed to re-look at this to determine whether we should have a position statement. We did not realize that the legislation was to be introduced to us and have a committee meeting on the night that we're having our policy forum tonight. That has really brought this level higher on the PR perspective because the press has been very interested in our position on medical marijuana. It has been introduced in Minnesota, as I said, and it's now time for us to engage in a conversation about the risks, the benefits, and other unintended consequences of legalizing marijuana in a medical marijuana format. Tonight we'll hear some background on medical marijuana, hear from a panel of experts who will discuss the pros and cons of legalizing medical marijuana, and have an opportunity for you all to share your thoughts and weigh in on this issue. I'm very excited about this conversation because I can tell you I've been asked questions from a wide variety of people. Anecdotally, I was supposed to be in another meeting tonight and said, no, I'm unable to go because I'm facilitating a conversation on medical marijuana. And even the feedback through the email system in my organization was, we should, we're hearing about this, give us information back from what the panel has said. So I think the time is right. I think we've got a great panel of experts here tonight. I'd like to start out by helping people understand our polling system. We want to find out who's in attendance. And we have the ability, with clickers in front of you, to be able to look at this. So the first question we have is, we'd like to know what your age is. And you can touch 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, and we'll be able to gather that information. I'll give people about 15 seconds to do that. Everybody has a clicker, I assume? And it is not identified by any individual, so you will not be able to tell an individual's age. So based on this, you can see that the ages are, the majority of people are in the 55 to 64 age group. And the second in attendance is the 45 to 54. We have one other question we'd like to ask before we get on with our presentations, and that's to find out what the background is. Are people primary care, non-primary care, or you're here as a non-physician not representing either primary or non-primary care? So, about 2/3 of the people are non-primary care, I'm sorry. Is that what I'm seeing? And about a third are primary care. Before we get started, are there any questions that people have before I introduce our main speaker? The format's very casual. We want people to feel free to ask questions. Our main speaker tonight has driven up from Rochester to be here and will be driving back to Rochester, but has time left at the end of his presentation to answer questions, but we need to be respectful of him getting back to Rochester tonight. But I know most of the panelists, and they are very willing to take questions, and we do not want this to be formal. We want this to be a very interactive experience for everybody here. I have a great pleasure in introducing our main speaker tonight, Dr. J. Michael Bostwick. He comes up, as I said, from Mayo. You all have his bio that's printed in your program, so I will be brief. Dr. Bostwick is a professor of psychiatry at the Mayo Clinic College of Medicine. He has research interests in diverse psychosomatic topics and suicidology, specifically as they relate to medical, surgical, hospital environments, end-of-life, ethical clarification, and decision-making. In 2012, Dr. Bostwick published an article in Mayo Clinic Proceedings titled Blurred Boundaries, the Therapeutics and Politics of Medical Marijuana, which will be the basis of his presentation here tonight. Please join me in welcoming Dr. J. Michael Bostwick. Yes.
Okay, can you hear me okay? All right. All right, well, I should explain, I do not have a horse in this race. This piece is, I wrote 2 years ago, and I wrote it out of a father's grief. My son was in treatment at that time. He now has 4 years of sobriety. And I was trying to understand what this thing was, recreational marijuana, but also had medical possibilities. So I spent probably a year reading everything I could and then put together what turned out to be a very long piece, 10,000 words, that ran in Mayo Clinic Proceedings. So I wrote that thing. It came out in February of 2012, and all of a sudden I've become a great media star, which is not my intent. But so I'll try to explain what I learned by writing this piece, and hopefully it will help to inform your discussion tonight. I have nothing to disclose. I do not and have not inhaled, and the munchies I just engaged with because it is dinner time. So if I could see this. All right. So I have 4 learning objectives for you. One is to appreciate the church family. All right. So I'd like you to appreciate that this is really, there's nothing new under the sun, at least with cannabis or marijuana. We have 5 millennia of history of it being used in various ways, medicinally, religiously, and recreationally. I'd like to say something about the demographics, risks, and benefits for both recreational and medical marijuana. And there's a link between those two things because people who have recreational experience are often much more likely to be interested in medical uses of this compound. I'd like to talk a bit about the endocannabinoid system, which was unknown at the time that the drug was in a Schedule I at the federal level. I think that's a key point because we have laws in place that do not acknowledge any of the science that has evolved in the past 4 decades. And finally, I'd like to talk a little bit about how my perception from reading the literature that the federal government stance is actually preventing the kind of research and science that we need to be logical about this, frankly. So, a quote from Carlini in 2004, "Very few drugs, if any, have such a tangled history as a medicine. In fact, prejudice, superstition, emotionalism, and even ideology have managed to lead cannabis to ups and downs concerning both its therapeutic properties and its toxicological and dependence-inducing effects." It has all of those things. And Georgianus, the well-known ethicist, wrote that marijuana is unique among illegal drugs, its political symbolism, its safety, and its wide use. So the outline of the talk about the history of the plant, what is medical marijuana, psychosis in marijuana, the endocannabinoid system, promising pharmaceutical applications, this standoff between the states and the federal government, which Minnesota is potentially going to join or not, and then a summary and conclusion. So that's what I'll try to do in the next 40 or 45 minutes. The history of the plant. Now, marijuana, this is a hemp leaf, and any of you who have had errant birds take a bird seed from Fleet Farm and drop it in your yard may have gotten a hemp plant growing there, because there are hemp seeds in bird seed. And it has had many, many uses throughout history, and actually throughout American history, as a livestock feed, as something that's used in construction, in making rope, in making cloth, in making oils. Many of you may use cosmetics that have hemp oil in them. Lots and lots of uses for a plant that has also been used recreational, medically, etc., in hybridized forms. So lots and lots of uses. This is the emperor of China 5,000 years ago, who first wrote about using this substance medicinally. And Shen Nung, 2000 BC, spoke about how this would be something that he might use in his folk medicine chest. And we can see that the use of this drug spread through the diaspora, if you think of China as the middle of the world. First in the Middle East, where we first hear about it, India, Syria, Persia, in 2,000, 1,400 years before the Christian era. Then really the modern era is brought in a paper that appeared in a British journal written by a British physician writing from Calcutta in the 1830s, in which, interestingly, I think, given the modern debate, he wrote about the cannabis being used for pretty much all of the indications that we're talking about right now. So the indications really are not in question either. He talked about pain, vomiting, convulsions, spasticity. You could read backwards, multiple sclerosis, Colorado children, pain and vomiting, Marinol, and Sesamet if you'd like. And the United States actually, for almost 100 years, had this as part of its official dispensary. And there were various formulations, tinctures, extracts, cigarettes, almost any way you could combine this plant was done. And it was part of what a doctor would have carried in his or her black bag, riding on a horse around places like rural Minnesota. This is Kavanaugh, that doctor who wrote from Calcutta in the 1830s about what he was learning about this compound, this plant that he had discovered in his travels to the British monarchy in India. This would be an example of the kind of bottle with a label, cannabis sativa, that a doctor might have had in his black bag. You can sort of ignore the 420 magazine right in the corner, but this is a kind that you could find, I suppose, in an antique store. Now, the rise of recreational use. Clearly, psychoactive effects are sought by people who use this drug who are not ill, and the effects are slowed time, increased awareness of your body, reduced focus, incoordination, sleepiness, getting kind of stupid. That's what people do this for, to relax, to dull out, to get foolish, dumb, whatever. And at least in the mid-20th century, the people who are most likely to be using it this way were three groups: European intellectuals, rural Brazilian blacks, and impoverished Mexicans. I'm not sure which one of these is not like the other. They all seem to be rather varied. But the point is, there were places in which this drug was known and used before the 1940s. And in the 1940s, 50s, 60s in the US, that's when the hedonistic explosion occurred. I'm sure that none of you here have any exposure ever at any time in your life to this drug, correct? Yes, well the point is it moved into the largely white population in the 50s, 60s, 70s and became a college campus kind of thing. And I'll say a little more about that a little later because it tends to end for most people after college because they don't want to be stupid anymore. That sounds a little wrong, doesn't it? Well, anyway. Okay, so this is a picture from the 1920s of Mexican immigrants being inspected on the U.S. border. So once again, a century later, there's really nothing new about that. There were concerns about people coming in from the south, country south, to work and to also bring foreign influences, including marijuana, with them. And anybody know what this is from? Reefer Madness. Yeah. And I just think the image is just marvelous. I need some dental work. But anyway, Drug of the Devil. These were posters from that film that came out in 1936. You would have thought that a drug that would eat your brain had been unleashed upon the world. But it was certainly drug-crazed, abandoned, youthful marijuana victims, a torture that never stops, high anxiety about this substance. I think I first saw this film when I was in college now in the 70s. This is a facsimile of a tax stamp, and I don't fully understand it, but prior to the marijuana being made illegal in the U.S. in 1970, there was an attempt to tax people. If you used it recreationally, you got charged 100 times the tax than if you used it medically. But I don't know the explanation for how that worked, how you proved in 1937 in Wisconsin that you were using it medically. In any case, the first effort to try to contain this drug was through taxation, not, which I guess would be a form of legal involvement. And then in 1970, marijuana was declared to, or cannabis was declared to join Schedule 1, along with other drugs like heroin, cocaine, ecstasy, trip, it's not a drug, but it's on the list anyway, LSD. And at that point, it became a Schedule I substance. Now, I'm going to say it repeatedly, but there was no science to justify it becoming a Schedule I drug because there was no science, except that in 1964, THC had been discovered as a chemical compound, but nothing much more was known about it. And nothing much more was known about it for several decades after that. And we'll talk a little about that. So, there's this kind of thing around, don't panic, it's organic. It could, of course, be sprayed with pesticides, but it's still organic. A natural medicine, and that's been part of the struggle. There is, of course, traditional, I don't know what we are, allopathic medicine doctors here mostly. We're kind of the establishment, and then there are folks who don't want to deal with the establishment, they want to use natural things, and marijuana falls in that camp, more or less. This is, again, from a federal website about marijuana being a gateway drug. Again, it has some of the reefer madness quality to it, although it's kind of gussied up in federal form. It is sort of interesting. I believe the only literature that actually supports marijuana as a gateway drug is that it's a gateway to tobacco smoking. So that's worth tucking away. Does not say it's not associated with the use of many other recreational drugs that are quite dangerous, but people who start with marijuana move on to cigarettes. Legalize, regulate, educate, medicate. That would seem to really encompass all of the controversy, really. And all of us probably have very different opinions on each one of those points. Certainly, I know that I do, if I had any opinions at all at this point. So, all over the map, I want to emphasize that at this point in this country, we have really the destruction of federalism. The way our legal system is set up is that states do have rights and states do have laws, but technically federal law is supposed to trump state laws when the feds don't agree with the state laws. At this point, 20 states and the District of Columbia have declared war on the federal government legal system, and the trouble, or at least the reality of it, is that all these 20 states are not in any kind of unison. They have different, some are legalizing it for medical purposes, a couple of states have legalized it for recreational purposes, some have decriminalized it, and some have done various combinations of those things. So the notion that somehow there is any kind of unity among the states is frankly ridiculous. There isn't any unity. It's very, each state is different. Even Colorado, which right now has been told by Holder that he will not interfere, has been told all these terms from the federal government by which, if Colorado follows those rules, the feds will not come in and shut the state down. But that's kind of bizarre too, because it's still illegal. I don't quite get that, but I can say more about that too if you want to know. So what is medical marijuana? Well, maybe it's a neon sign in some states. But there are three potential medical marijuanas, and it's important to know which one that you're talking about, because that will help to inform whichever debate you happen to be having at the moment. And frankly, I don't know what your experience is, but my experience is I often almost have to, when I'm having a conversation, say, what are we talking about here? What are the terms? Because you get hit from every direction, and you've got to figure out what it is you're talking about. So first of all, endocannabinoids are neurotransmitters that are produced in human tissue, anandamide being the most well-known. And these are arachidonic acid derivatives, and these were simply not known until the 1980s and 90s at all. So there was no correlate for why THC at all would matter in the human body. Phytocannabinoids are what we're talking about in terms of plants. So these are cannabinoids that are produced in plants. We know that a cannabis plant has at least 60 different cannabinoid compounds in it, most of which we know nothing about. Two we do know something about, THC and CBD, but we don't know as much as we should know about them. And then finally, synthetic cannabinoids, which are synthesized in laboratories. Now, there are many, many synthetic cannabinoids, and actually, if you look a little further, Spice et al., another drug scourge, is a synthetic cannabinoid, or there are many that fall under that rubric. But in any case, since 1985, we've had two legal cannabinoid-based drugs in our arsenal. One is dronabinol, which is synthetic THC. The other is nabilone, which is an analog of synthetic THC, and both of those have been available for cancer pain and for enhancing appetite.